and the creative scene. And I would like to invite her to take over the session. Thank you very much, Mshai.
Thank you very much, George, and it is such a pleasure. I really want to thank both Journalists for Justice and the KHRC for organizing what already for me has been such an illuminating session. And I note that that's the word that has come up a lot in the chat as we have listened to the first set of presentations. I've learned so much. So I just want to thank all of the presenters who have appeared already and also for just your very insightful thoughts. And we certainly are looking forward to the rest of the session. In the second panel, we're going to hear from the experiences from Kenya, as well as Tanzania and from Rwanda. And without much ado, I would like to introduce the first speaker. The first speaker will be speaking on the Kenyan experience, and this is David Ndii. David Ndii is a public intellectual who probably needs no introduction, especially to the Kenyans who are following this, having been a columnist and an author, both in the daily papers and on the Elephant, which is an online site. He has been described as one of Africa's best-known economists and an outspoken anti-corruption crusader. David has been ranked among the most influential economists, not only in Africa, but also in the world. He wears several hats. He was educated at the University of Nairobi and at Oxford University, and certainly many people know him as an academic. But he also has political experience, having been the chief strategist for the opposition platform NASA in Kenya's 2017 election. And before that, David has played key advisory roles in Kenya's public affairs. I know he's worked a lot on a lot of policy and is probably best known in that sector as being the key consultant on the chapter on public finance in Kenya's constitution making process. So David, we look forward to what you have to say. Karibu. David, I think you might have to unmute.
I tell you. Thank you, Mshai. Thank you, KHRC and JFJ for having me come to reflect on this rather problematic subject on our continent, certainly in our country, as I will be recounting. I am particularly delighted to hear Miriam Matembe. She may not remember, but we sort of met and interacted a lot in the late 90s in the global anti-corruption movement. When she was still as vocal and as passionate as she is today on issues of governance in Africa. So I'm really delighted to see her. And of course, everybody else, Brian and all the other sort of friends and colleagues, and all the people who are online who I am not able to see in the moment. I am going to sort of try and speak to these as a personal reflection, because obviously this is a subject that we deal with a lot and we think about a lot, especially as you had, as we are sort of quite politically engaged. It's something that our kind of political engagements here you cannot avoid. But I sort of also from more of an intellectual reflection rather than a political one. I don't want to subject you to political manenos. And I want to start from the framing of our problem, of our political problem. Go back to Samuel Huntington's 1968 book, Political Order in Changing Societies. And the framing of the political problem of changing societies are that of order and stability. That sort of, it has different dimensions, people do think differently about it. but I certainly find myself increasingly going back to it when I look at all the things going on around the continent, the challenge of establishing order and stability. And in that sort of further elaborates that highlights two critical elements of being able to establish order and political order and stability. One of those is legitimacy. And that's basically that the state has authority which is obeyed by the citizens, because obviously if the state is not being obeyed, governance becomes very costly because the only way that you can govern is by force. If there's no legitimacy, then the alternative to legitimacy is force. And we've seen that. We've seen how costly, and you don't even achieve it. If you try and use force, you may do it, but you actually won't achieve very much. But the second one, which is the one we are talking about today, is orderly transfer of power. Yeah, you have to be legitimate and you have to have orderly transfer of power, because if you do not have a system of orderly transfer of power, every time that transfer of power is inevitable because people are mortal, then the political order is at the risk of collapsing. And we've seen that a lot of times, isn't it? If you have a state which has legitimacy, and that state also, if there's orderly transitions of power, the people, don't really worry about it. It will be stable, and over time, it will probably be able to develop and sort of have peace and stability and all other things. So when you strip off culture, institutions, all manner of things, I think why I find myself going back to this is because it's a bare bones. I guess as an economist, these sort of parsimonious models appeal to us, which strip everything down to the basics. And that's what really are the fundamentals of political society. Now, if you look throughout history, history has found only two systems, I think, which are able to transfer power in an orderly manner and are successful and are well established. One of which is primogeniture, that the son or the daughter will succeed the father or the mother, otherwise known as monarchy or dynastic rule or whatever you want to call it. And it is stable because the rules is very simple, the eldest son or the eldest daughter. And if that one is not capable, then the second one, So that's why they say, the king is dead, long live the king. Because there's no vacuum. As soon as the king dies, you know who the next king is. And you can therefore go about your business as usual. You don't fear that the military will take over because there is a vacuum. And the second one, of course, is elections. And the election rule says that the society will be governed by a bunch of people who organize themselves and then offer themselves bid for power to the public and or certain publics, sometimes the full public, universal suffrage, sometimes limited publics. And as long as it's accepted, it might be a council of chiefs, it might be a theocracy, it might be the imams, but like Iran. But the point is, whichever public is decided will make the decision, then that public will make the decision that those are the people who are going to govern for a limited period. And when that period ends, that bunch of people or an individual goes away and another bunch of people comes in. So those are the only systems that I think we know that are stable and are able to succeed. Now, in my Gikuyu society, before colonialism, we had a system which I think is well known in Kenya called as Itweka, which was generational transitions. So the society would divide its age sets. Age sets were divided into two. When you are initiated, you are told you are either Mwangi or Maina. If your father is Mwangi, you are Maina. If you are Maina, then your father is Mwangi. Like my father is Mwangi, so I'm Maina. And every sort of couple of generations, 30 or 35 years or so, there would be a huge transition because Kikuyu society was governed by councils. And these councils governed by sort of what you might call assemblies. Every council, whether it's a military council, it had an assembly. Whether it's the junior elders, it had assembly. Whether it's the women, they had an assembly. And these assemblies are the ones which governed. So, and the people who sat in those assemblies were called Adhamaki. So the Adhamaki were nominated from the ruling age set. Is it minor? Then it's the minors. Then after a sort of period, it goes back to Mwangi. And this system, actually, the last time this happened was in 1898, the last time we have it on record. And of course, after colonialism, it was disrupted. The next one was supposed to happen around 1930 or 1935. But by then, Maina, who was the ones which had succeeded, I believe, were now entrenched as, because that's who the colonialists found. And they found these people, they thought they were the actually ruling class. They didn't understand that Mwangi and Maina were like political parties, which had agreed how they will be interchanging power. They are not classes. They are like political parties. So these people are already now entrenched themselves as colonial auxiliaries because they were the ones they found sitting in the councils, and they thought they were chiefs. And so they sort of got them into become colonial auxiliaries. And of course, once they get entrenched in the colonial system, they refuse to leave. So the next Situeka in 1930s did not happen. And it is said that, in fact, the uprising, the Mau Mau uprising, was started by the age set that was supposed to come into power. So because they could not, because now the entrenched, the other age set was entrenched by colonial power, then the only way, so that it's always a confusion, was Mau Mau about sort of liberating the nation, or was it actually a power struggle within the Kikuyu sort of community? And that is still a historical debate that has not been resolved. Or it was probably an element of it, because most of the the Mwangi generation who were supposed to take over also happened to be the guys who went to the Second World War. So when they came back and they could not sort of take their place, they organized an uprising. Now, why am I sort of going into all these sort of stories? Because every African society, I believe, had the same, as elaborate a system of transfer of power. Some very subtle, others ranging from monarchy, like the Buganda kingdom and whatever others, like the Kikuyu. I know that the northern Kenyan people, what do you call it, Oromo, had something very similar to the Kikuyu and all of that. Now, it so happens, if you think about the Wanga kingdom and all those in Kenya and all those others. Now, if you look at countries in Africa where there is a coincidence of those sort of prior ethnic nations and the state, like Swaziland, for instance, they don't have this problem of transfer of power. I think it's fair to say, I think it stands to reason that if the Buganda kingdom was a nation state, it too would not have a problem of transition of power, because they have their system, I mean, still exists of the Kabaka. Even after the Kabaka was deposed for many years, I think for how long? When it came back to restoring the Kabaka, the next Kabaka in line was known. You know, he was gallivanting somewhere in London. They went and got him, and he came back and he assumed the throne, and I think he's still there. If you then come now to think about the complexity of a country which has 40 different communities with many diverse systems of transferring power among them, and then you put them together, and the first actual transfer of power from then the colonial to sort of statehood was mediated. It was midwifed by the Brits. And we know from our history that, in fact, there was a lot of disagreement among the leaders of the national, what you call the founding fathers. By the time they were coming from London, they actually did not have an agreement. They just were impatient to get independence. So they came. And then they were then confronted with this system where they had 3 seats of power. There was a prime minister, there was a governor general, and then there is the queen as the head of state. And I think the way I sort of simplify sometimes, they look at this thing and they say, this this thing is too complicated and we have too many problems. Let us just collapse it into one thing. And in Kenya, we collapsed it into a thing we call the imperial presidency. And not only did we collapse it into a thing we call an imperial presidency, as it evolved, and it did in many other countries in Africa, it was also implicitly evolved into a president for life. Yeah, Kenyatta was a president for life. Nyerere was a president for life. Yeah, I think almost for life. I think it's just that a concept for them. So you get that fast transition mediated by the British, and then we are left on our own to try and figure out how do you do this sort of thing. And the assumption that we would immediately assume an electoral system, and it would just work like clockwork. If you think how many kings had to be beheaded for the electoral system to work, and for transfer to power in the revolutions and all manner of places, it shouldn't surprise that we've struggled so much. We struggle so much. So obviously the Kenyatta thing was mediated by the fact that the man died in office. But even before he died in office, because it was fairly apparent that he was going to, there is quite a lot of interesting political gymnastics of people trying to cling to power, change the constitution, movement, things called Gorokos. It's a movie script. I think if those people is there's a good book about it actually, the Kenyatta succession, and quite a few other writings about it. So it was but the man died in office. Then there was a couple of other things. If you come to the next one, the next what seems to be a transition would have been 1992 under the multi-party. And that again was something which was mediated by external, and I'm talking about Kenya and then generalizing, was mediated by the end of the Cold War dynamics, the wind of change and all that sort of stuff. That's the one which, for instance, had Nyerere and Kaunda, who would have been presidents for life, like Kenyatta. It sort of forced them out of office, and then thereafter, if you look at again Kenya and other countries, our transfers of power have been mediated by end of term, what we call constitutional term limits. Then term limits come into force, so that the next actual transition of an individual, which was Moi leaving office, was a term limit. Thing, because the electoral system around sort of Moi to play games and play divide and rule and do all manner of things, and therefore managed to do another 2 terms under the new constitution. But when it came to end of term, it was then mediated by luck. Because I think in looking at Moi thinking about his post-retirement security and all that kind of thing, he had made political calculations that he would be best succeeded by a Kikuyu. Yeah, by the Kikuyu elite. And those are the people he felt, I think, would be most secure to give back power to, as I would say. And it so happened, I don't think it was designed, that both candidates, the one he sponsored and the one opposition sponsored, were both Kikuyus, and from the same political class and sort of in very many respects from the same sort of political stable. And he was indifferent between the two. Moi became indifferent between the two. So that's why I'm saying that particular transition was mediated by luck. Since then, we have then developed, you think you've solved the problem of transfer of power because you have term limits. But since then, we developed a problem of mid-tenure because we put 2 term limits. Obviously, that introduced the prospects of the elected president at the end of term leaving at the end of their first term, even though they are eligible for a second. And now our problem becomes not one of constitutional limits, but of people insisting that they must have 2 full terms, almost like an entitlement. So we have the first major political crisis in 2007 because some people decide 5 terms is too short for Kibaki, and you must have a second term. I was told just before the 2017 election, a whistleblower actually, who had been in a meeting around, I think, May, June, that it had been decided by the people we call deep state in Kenya that Uhuru would not be the first one-term president under their watch. So they took it as an affront that an election could be lost by an incumbent who was entitled to a second term. So the state sort of, the bureaucrats and other sort of the bureaucracy and other people in the state, they have developed this culture that it is their responsibility. That's what I picked up, that it is their responsibility to ensure that the incumbent wins the second term. And therefore, when they realized that they had assumed that there would not be a strong challenge. So they realized very late that there was a very strong challenge. And then they sort of quickly crossed back and said, no, this, we cannot allow this to happen. It will really be another cup. And of course, then we ended up with the 2017 midterm crisis, similar to the 2007 one. Now, we are now headed to the end of term, end of the constitution, or what you might call the constitution term limit. And now we have a very interesting dynamic of an actual end of term limit, end of term limit tenure. We don't know how it will pan out, but there is clearly parallels. What you see is parallels of the 1976 Change the Constitution movement in terms of this thing being called BBI, where now politicians are saying, wait a minute, this sort of system which says you finish and go, they are now looking at how they can sort of make all sorts of adjustments so that they can accommodate a transition, so that you can have a managed transition. So that the incumbent, they don't want to be managed, the transition to be managed by the electorate. The people in the office want to manage the transition themselves. And they decide how, who will come in and how the ones who come in will take care of the ones who are leaving, you know. That's sort of, and this is completely oblivious, or one might say, you can see that it's a completely self-absorbed. It's a completely self-absorbed process which actually do not consider that the rules of the game, that really, if it's the end of your term, you should go home, and the ones who want to contest power should subject themselves to the electorate, and the ones who win, you know, may the best man or woman win. That is something that they don't seem ready to accept. So there's a political culture problem. And I think that is that brings us to the question of this disconnect between the legitimacy of the rules and what sort of the democracy, or you're going to call democracy, call it republicanism, and the fact that the political culture of the leadership culture of the countries have not accepted that this is the method that will ensure society has orderly transfer of power. It is interesting that, because if you hear what they're talking about restoring something which looks like a parliamentary system, which they themselves eschewed in when we were writing a new constitution. Yet, what I find paradoxical, these are some of my closing remarks, is if what they're interested in is in longevity, in power, then parliamentary system, the most long-lived sort of people in power is prime ministers under the parliamentary system. Think about Lee Kuan Yew. Think about Mahathir Mohamad, the sort of East Asian benevolent dictators, as they call them, that they like to emulate. There's no term limit in a parliamentary system. So as long as you can hold your coalition or your performance and whatever it is, you can stay as long as Lee Kuan Yew stayed, and he retired on age ground. Even if you look at Western countries, some of the longest lived people governing there, Margaret Thatcher, I remember Helmut Kohl, I think now Angela Merkel, these are people who've been in power for 10 plus years. So I find it paradoxical that they want longevity, but they have not chosen the system which gives you a chance at longevity. In fact, it gives you a chance to leave and come back, like Berlusconi. you can leave and come back 2 or 3 times. Yet when they had an opportunity, they gravitated towards a presidential system, which obviously puts an absolute term limit on when you should, and also gives you a sort of, you don't have the discretion about when you call an election and all of that. What I do here now is that the person who thinks he wants to be president is going to be president like Raila Odinga. When they are now beginning is that he would like still to maintain a presidential system and therefore appoint a weak prime minister. And that's where this thing is stuck. While the ones who want to be protected would like a weak presidency and a strong sort of elected prime minister. I think in the character of that Putin-Medvedev arrangement, where you can then succeed yourself or even have a sort of control the leadership. So when you think about it, there is a very strong element of personal power involved in all these sort of in all this engagement, which has actually not removed from. It's the problem of what exactly is our problem of why people don't want to leave power, or why they feel insecure if they leave power. Like Mutharika, he feels insecure. He could have left very nicely last year. Yeah, and he didn't. He has now had to live in sort of not very auspicious circumstances. But nothing's going to happen to him, I don't think. I think I don't think that he's going to be harmed or whatever, any harm is going to come to him because of that. So what was he afraid of? Or what we need to find out, what is this thing that makes people hostage to office and power, even when it is evident that they can leave without any problem. Moi left and lived many years, even though there was so much apprehension and sort of whatever that if Moi leaves, what would happen? You know, nothing happened. He lived. He died the other day, you know, quite peacefully as a very old man. So we need, I think, the problematic is to figure out what this paradox is, that there's some obsession with power, which actually begins to look irrational. This sort of it begins to look irrational. I actually do not think that Uhuru Kenyatta or the Kenyatta family is actually at any risk if they just stop all these games, finish his term, and make sure we have a free and fair election and go home. So there is that sort of disconnect, which is very difficult to sort of explain. I think that's the problematic of power that we need to deal with. I think it has that legacy of obviously there's the spoils of power, wealth, status, and that kind of thing. There's a legacy of the big man politics from those days. Yeah, there's a legacy of the big man politics. There is the patronage sort of system and state capture by various elements for purposes of sort of enriching themselves and all manner of things. But I think ultimately, what it's telling us, I do not think, that's what we need to ask, is there a constitutional or electoral engineering? That's the question. Is there a constitutional or electoral engineering that can actually save this problem? I don't think so. So what we really need to think, in my view, is the culture of power. I think that's where the answer to this problem of transition, management of transitions. If we can get to the heart of what it is about the culture of power that makes it so that clinging to office, irrational clinging to office, such an attractive option, I think that's probably where our answer lies. Let me stop there.
Thank you, David. That was such an illuminating presentation. I thought that I would kind of know most of what you are going to say, and I found myself also again taking notes because you started us by thinking about this duality, what you call the basics of political society and legitimacy and the orderly transfer of power. And then I was wondering, where is he going to go with this? But then you took us through the importance of understanding the historical context that the present has emerged out of. And it struck me that we talk all the time about the key role that ethnicity plays in Kenyan politics, but I have never thought about it in quite the way that you put it, so that when we think of it in terms of the transitions, starting with the transition of a multi-ethnic nation country, transition into a multi-ethnic nation, country, from a set of very disparate political systems and frameworks, which was midwifed by the colonial government. And we are still now ending up in a place where, again, the political elite is trying to midwife us into a political arrangement that they can control. Understanding how the imperial presidency emerged and how that morphed into the presidency for life, and then how that was also made a transition into a presidency with constitutional term limits, but that idea of term limits then got tinkered with. And now that we are facing what you have called really the question, we really need to understand this question of our political power that seems to hinge on the question of power. Understanding how do we get these people to move? What is it about power that is so seductive that people get obsessed by it? So I really want to thank you very much for putting several questions on the table. I see that several of them are coming up. And I want to suggest to the participants, I mean to the panelists, that you do have the ability to start to answer some of the questions on the Q&A, and you can type in some of the answers, so that if we don't have enough time to go to all the questions, maybe there's a way that as you listen and as if you have got answers that you want to give the panelists, whichever of the participants in the Q&A, you do have the ability to answer that and as a typed answer. I also want to encourage participants to put your questions in the Q&A, because that makes it easier for the panelists to see. Within the chat, there's a lot of conversation that is going on. And so now we will go to the next presenter. The next presenter comes to us is Lewis Murch, who is the Central Africa Director from Human Rights Watch, and he focuses on Rwanda as one of the countries under his watch. Lewis has lived in Africa for over 13 years. Part of that, he was the field manager for the Interactive Radio for Justice, which is an organization that is dedicated to creating local radio programs that concentrated specifically on the International Criminal Court proceedings. Some of you might be familiar with his name because he has written several Human Rights Watch reports, and his op-eds have also appeared in many papers and in news outlets. He has a master's in international politics from the University of London's School of Oriental and African Studies. Lewis, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, and sorry for joining late. I'm assuming everyone can hear. I'll take that as a yes. And that was a fantastic session from David that I was able to catch. I lived in Central Africa in Rwanda for a number of years, but I don't anymore. I'm speaking to you now from the States, the principal reason for that was because I was made persona non grata in Rwanda for having conversations like this one. So I think that's an interesting sort of initial commentary on sort of managed political transitions from a Rwandan context. These are difficult conversations to have in Rwanda. I am obviously not Rwandan. Because of my profile, I can speak openly and publicly about the situation in Rwanda in terms of the political situation now and where it's come from. But I would argue that that's a very difficult thing for a Rwandan to do because of the sensitivities around this issue. So I think that should be noted. Oftentimes it has to be someone from outside to really speak honestly, and that's fine because the outsider is protected, but that's not good because the outsider obviously lacks a lot of context, cultural context, historical context. I don't speak Ken Rwanda. So just something to note. In talking about, as I close my WhatsApp here, in talking about transition and managing a transition, I think just for the sake of brevity, I think we need to start in Rwanda as it is now, which is really what was created in 1994 at the end of the genocide and the end of the civil war in Rwanda. As you all know, the RPF, which is currently run by President Paul Kagame, won that war and in many ways succeeded in stopping that genocide, halting that genocide. With it, he was able to create a new system. And what the RPF did and what Kagame did, I think was strategic and was very intelligent. They took someone who used to be a member of a former government's party, the party of Habyarimana, and they installed him as president. So this was Pasteur Bizimungu. He was installed as president with virtually no power. He was in most ways a puppet to Kagame. And I think for Rwanda watchers at the time, and being someone who's now looking, who's been looking at the political situation in Rwanda, which, I'll get to, but you'll hear me allude to how repressive it is. For us who are trying to figure out how we got to where we are, the installation of Pastor Bizimungu and what happened to him is very instructive for the modern day Rwandan political context. So Pastor Bizimungu, he was legitimate for two folds, in terms of a front man. Number one, he was from Habyarimana's government before. He had been a minister, but he had left and joined the RPF quite early. He had joined the RPF in 1990, which gave him some real credibility as an RPF, as a head of an RPF, and a president from that party, because he had joined 4 years before the war ended and before the RPF actually took power. So he was very much an ideal candidate to put forward for the RPF. But what happened quite quickly, and vice president was Paul Kagame, and what happened quite quickly was you start to see a real consolidation of power around Kagame. There was never any question that this was going to be a true power sharing deal. And you start to see in the sort of late 90s, you start to see a movement, a divergence between Bizimungu and Kagame with regards to basically the main issue, which was how to deal with dissent, how to deal with people who were against what was happening in the country, with the government, in terms of reconciliation. Not all of this was government policy. There was some voices about, did the people who committed the genocide get off too quickly and too easily? There was lots of calls in the late 90s for real revenge. So there was a lot of different factors. You had, well, the numbers are considerably up for contention, but basically you had between 500,000 and 1 million people killed during the genocide, majority Tutsi, some moderate Hutu, and a lot of divergent voices, as to how to reconstruct this country. Not only do you have that, but you also have a refugee crisis in the Congo, and you have Rwanda, an active participant in a war in the Congo at the same time. So a lot of different balls in the air, and there was clearly going to be a lot of dissent. There was going to be a lot of questions as to about how things were happening. And Kagame made a decision quite early that dissent was not going to be tolerated, that it was going to be his way, the RPF's way, and that was going to be it. And Pastor Bizimungu was not from that school of thought. He had been active in trying to push for democratization before, in the late 80s, into the early 90s under the Habyarimana government. And so the divergence between the two occurred. I think what now when we look at Rwanda, what was most striking was that how a lot of the same tactics with regards to political opponents are being used now that were being used then. What happened was, number one, you start to see allegations of corruption emerge against Pastor Bizimungu. This is something that I think Kagame continues to use strategically. It is very difficult for Western, countries such as the United States to be critical of a crackdown on corruption. That's something that plays very well with, international, partners, with the United Nations. Cracking down on corruption is broadly seen as, yes, it's a good thing. So
no doubt, just a little, because of the translators, if you could speak just a little bit slower.
Oh, excuse me. Sure. I apologize. So you have Pastor Bizimungu accused of corruption sort of in the later years of his presidency. This is going to culminate with him resigning in 2000 and trying to form his own political party. And really the sort of, I would argue really the last legitimate attempt at a democratic challenge to the current political structure we have in Rwanda. You had a very legitimate figure in Pastor Bizimungu, a minister under the former government, the president, who then resigned because of his disagreements with Kagame. And you had him try to create a political party. Subsequently, he was arrested. So that was the real indication, if you will, that dissent was not going to be tolerated up to the highest levels in Rwanda. He was arrested on very spurious charges. He was convicted and he was placed in jail. He was subsequently placed under house arrest. And then later he was pardoned by Kagame, I believe, if my memory is correct, in 2004. However, he's still alive. He's never been allowed to have any degree of a public profile in Rwanda. In 2000, with the arrest of Bizimungu, Kagame simply got rid of all the pretexts and had himself, was after an election, was elected president. He's since been the president, obviously, for the last 20 years, and he'll continue to be the president with a referendum in 2017. He'll continue to be the president for many years to come. I think before I get to some sort of broader lessons with regards to the current situation and how this transition, I think, has been informative of that. Another aspect with regards to Kagame's tenure as president is that he's had to do a political game in order to stay in power. I missed the talk of Burundi with the referendum, which I'm sure was touched upon, but Kagame really has learned lessons from the region with regards to how to conduct a referendum, a constitutional referendum, changing the constitution, allowing him to stay on. He applied those lessons in 2017 and has enabled himself to stay on for many years to come. I think of all the referendums we've seen, I think the one we've seen recently in the region, the one in Rwanda was the most strategically done. He had a very good PR strategy. If people will remember, for many years leading up to the referendum, Kagame said he was not going to do it. He was not going to try to change the constitution to enable him to stay on. This was not going to happen. He didn't want to run for president again in 2017. He went so far as saying things like, this is going to be a reflection of a failure of my leadership if we can't put anyone in power. And for a number of years, there was people who thought that he was going to step down. There was talk of perhaps his wife was going to enter into the political fold. She has a very high profile, Jeanette Kagame. There was talk of Louise Mushikiwabo, the current head of the Francophonie, who was the former foreign affairs minister. There was talk of installing her. As everyone will know, Rwanda's parliament is majority female. So there was a real inclination into thinking that maybe there would be a female president in the EAC, and you know, Rwanda would lead the way on it. That started to go out of by the wayside in 2016 when we started to see this talk of referendum pick up. It started in Parliament. It started with parliamentarians saying that Rwandans have the legitimate right to express their desire to see Kagame stay on. And that was the first inclination for us that, oh, something is going on here, because Parliament is very much controlled by the executive, and nothing would ever be said in Parliament without the blessing of the executive. So that was the first inclination that something was happening. That was followed shortly after with these incredibly organized mass rallies across the country, with tens of thousands of people participating. They were basically advocating to their local administrators that they insisted that Kagame stay on. I was still in Rwanda at the time, and I have to tell you, the level of coordination was so striking that there's no way that these could have been spontaneous sort of locally organized types of rallies. These were rallies that were very much had the feel of being top down, of being controlled by a central authority, organized via central authority. People were receiving, this was still, smartphones were not necessarily in everyone's hand at this point. This is 2015 in Rwanda, so smartphones weren't in everyone's hand, but people were still receiving text messages from blanket text messages on MTN, telling them that they had to be at this rally at this location at a certain date. And what you saw was basically a staged, managed, popular uprising to insist that Kagame stay on. I think the most striking testimonies from people were the people that stood up and who said they would commit suicide if Kagame left office. That was, that to me struck me as very dramatic. That picked up the media. International press picked up on that as well. You had women standing up saying, if he leaves, I'm going to kill myself. And so what you went from was a situation where he was saying he didn't want to do it. He didn't want to do it. He didn't want to run for more terms. He didn't want to change the constitution. You had Tony Blair saying, who's a good friend of Kagame, saying there's no way he's going to do it. This guy's a man of his word. He's not going to do it. To this parliamentarian effort followed by these mass uprisings insisting that he stay, to finally culminating with Kagame very reluctantly, so he says, accepting to begin the process of a constitutional referendum, which would enable him to change the term limits, to run again for president in 2017. Being on the ground and watching it all unfold, it was a staged, managed, very strategic, very forward-thinking, multi-year strategy with how to get from point A with term limits to point B with continuing on in power and making it, at least giving the perception that this was sort of being done by a popular movement, and that Kagame was doing it reluctantly. And here we are now, where he is staying on as president, and frankly, I don't think he has any inclination of leaving. There's a lot of allusions made to Russia with Rwanda, and to the moves that Putin continues to pull. There was a lot of talk that he might install a PM and a weak PM and sort of rule through him, or Kagame would become PM rather, and install a weak president and sort of rule through him. I think David just then was talking about an interesting point, which was this sort of irrational clinging to power, which I just noted down, this culture of power that you were just speaking to. I think it's different in Rwanda. And I think we can look to recent events to see why. I would say that Kagame is staying in power for two reasons. Number one, three reasons. Number one, and objectively, as someone who's lived in Rwanda, he's done a pretty good job. You have to admit, and this is difficult for me to say as Human Rights Watch, but putting political, and civil rights aside, and rule of law aside, the growth, the macroeconomic growth has been extraordinary. He is, yes, I think there are levels of corruption in Rwanda. However, they are managed in a way whereby it doesn't stifle growth at a critical level. And I think the growth has been, I witnessed it firsthand. And so I think he thinks he's done a good job in many aspects, legitimately. And I'm saying this as someone who's been kicked out of the country, but he has done a good job. And I think he wants to stay on. Number two, and I think more to the point, I don't think he can leave power. I think he's protected by his presidency. And when I say protected, I mean physically protected. And I think we can look to two key cases to sort of flesh this out. Kagame, in my opinion, is not worried about Hutu rebels in the Congo, the FDLR, former ties to the Interahamwe folks who carried out the genocide. The threat for Kagame comes from within, comes from the majority Tutsi group with whom he took power back in 1994. And recent events highlight this. Rwanda is known for executions of political dissidents. This is both inside Rwanda, with people who just simply won't toe the line. Finally, they have a bad habit of disappearing or being killed, but also outside of Rwanda. And people who are killed outside of Rwanda are the ones that are much more high profile. I'm assuming we have a lot of Kenyans on the phone. Everyone will remember 1998 when Seth Sedashonga was murdered in Nairobi. Former, seriously high Hutu member of the RPF, legitimate member of the RPF, government minister, started criticizing Kagame and was murdered. These murders have continued into, today, these days. And I think the two most recent and high profile examples, and the ones that really highlight how he can't leave power, are the attempted murder of Kayumba Nyamwasa in South Africa in 2010, and the murder of Patrick Karegeya again in South Africa in 2014. Both of these murders, the attempted murder of Kayumba and the murder of Karegeya, South African investigators and courts have demonstrated these were stemming from the Rwandan High Commission. They have been hit by levels of diplomatic walls to carry those investigations further, but they've publicly announced that these plots came from South Africa. And what they demonstrate is that Kagame is very scared of his inner circle. Both of these men, Karegeya and Nyamwasa, were part of the liberation. Both of these men, Tutsi, both of these men from the extreme inner circle. You have other men, many in the States, here in the States, who were really much a part of that liberation group, and they've broken off with Kagame. And now I genuinely think his protection comes from the fact that he is an executive. I do not think he would be comfortable in Kigali. Not being the president, he would have to have an extraordinary level of security around him that may not be feasible if he were not the executive. So I do think that in Rwanda, we're looking at a situation whereby he will stay on indefinitely, and that it will be tolerated as long as, alluding to what I said earlier, he does that good job, especially in terms of public health, education, and the macroeconomics, and which the scorecard continues to be relatively good. I think what's problematic for us at Human Rights Watch, and this is something that when we have talks like this is something I always try to say, is that the argument in Rwanda today, when Kagame speaks, when people speak about, when people genuinely speak about political space and about the media, those two issues in particular, the standard argument is this: listen, we had a genocide 25, 26 years ago. We are not, we had hundreds of thousands of bodies in the streets. We are not in a place where we can open up to multi-party politics, where we can open up the media to criticizing things. We're still in, for us, this is still early days. So while maybe we'll try to get there, we're not there yet. We can't get there yet. And we're gonna stay where we are, which is, repressive. And the argument, and this is why, conversations like this, I think, are very important with regard to transitions, because when you look at the government before the RPF government, so the government of Habyarimana, the genocide didn't happen because there was political space. The genocide didn't happen because there was an independent media that was challenging the government. Radio Mille Collines, the sort of noxious anti-Tutsi Hutu extremist radio, was not an independent radio station. That was a radio station created by Félicien, financed by Félicien Kabuga, who recently was arrested in France and who spent many years in Kenya. The conditions that put in place the genocide were the conditions of repression. Now I am not saying that there's going to be another genocide in Rwanda. I think steps have been taken with regards to ethnic reconciliation. So I'm not saying that at all, but it does negate the argument that Rwanda is not ready for any degree of multi-party politism. On the contrary, I think Rwanda needs to get to that place because frankly, with regards to political transitions, what we're seeing right now is a dead-end street. How does this not end violently? Anyone who comes up the ranks in Rwanda is neutralized, whether that be politically marginalized or whether that be something worse, in which they have to flee the country. I'll just close because I know we're getting close to time and we have a lot of questions, but I'll just close with one final anecdote, which I think is telling, which really demonstrates the power of the executive and how delicate this question of political transition is in Rwanda. Tarcisse Karugarama, who was the former Minister of Justice, one of the longest serving ministers in modern day Rwanda, really someone, a Prosecutor General, Minister of Justice, someone regarded as the foundation of modern day jurisprudence in Rwanda, drafted genocide ideology law, revised it, really knows his stuff. In 2014, he was giving an interview to The Guardian, a UK paper. And he just said very quickly, in a very aside way that he thought Kagame would step down when his term limits were over. And within a week, Kagame publicly said he needs to mind his own business. He was out of power, and now he's completely marginalized. He is basically in the same boat as Bizimungu, as someone who has no say whatsoever in the future for Rwanda. So, the very powerful who even attempt just to say, I think the president may do the right thing and abide by the Constitution, can also be brought down just by virtue of having this conversation. I'll stop there because I think we only have like 25 or 30 minutes left.
Thank you very, very much. And given, as you have said, the limitation of not being yourself from the country, I think you've done a really good job of giving us a really good understanding, starting in 1994, and that transition from a very difficult situation to taking us through what happens when you've got an unlikely coalition, and with time that increasingly frays to the next transition, where Kagame ascended to the presidency, and the question of really how to keep managing the question of sooner or later there's going to have to be a transition. David had mentioned how the model for President for life gave way to the constitutional limit of the presidential terms. And you've taken us on through to the next, if you want, the logical conclusion of that there is only so long that you can keep managing the constitutional term, and what happens when that ends out. So in Rwanda, we have seen the management of the performance of popular will that probably has taken us back to the return to the president for life model. But the sober questions that you leave us with is, given the historical context, not only the memory of the genocide, but the repression that preceded it, it is understandable that there is willingness to retain the status quo, but for how long can this be sustained? And what happens after that? And so those are really sobering questions for us to reflect on. As I bring in our last, but definitely not the least of the panelists, I know the question came on earlier on, people were already looking forward to the presentation from Tanzania. And so it is a pleasure to welcome Fatma Karume. Fatma Karume is a Tanzanian lawyer. She is a former president of the Tanganyika Law Society. Her specialization is litigation, and she has spearheaded the litigation department at a major law firm. Fatma is perhaps best known in terms of her association with various landmark judgments at both at the Court of Appeal and as well as the High Court of Tanzania. Karibu sana, Fatma.
Asante sana, Mshai. So I suppose what I need to say about Tanzania is that we are no different from other countries in our region with respect to transition of power. What I can say is that we took on the same model that David Ndii has discussed, and I found that very interesting. We decided to go for the imperial presidency as opposed to the constitutional Westminster model. So immediately after independence in Tanzania, the funniest thing happened. Our prime minister of the time, who was Julius Kambarage Nyerere, decided to give up his position as prime minister under the Westminster model. And if you all recall, all colonies, English colonies or British colonies at independence were handed an independence constitution under which the Queen was the monarch, and she was represented in the state by the governor. So we had the same constitution. We had a governor general who represented the Queen, and a prime minister who was appointed by the Queen, as in the Westminster model. Our head of police would be appointed by the Queen through the governor. Our head of the army would be appointed by the Queen through the governor. The civil service, major positions in the civil service would be appointed by the Queen through the governor. But we must recall that in the Westminster model, the Queen is non-partisan. And the governor was also non-partisan. So the Queen does not involve herself in politics at all, and does not make decisions based on political affiliations. So when the governor would appoint a inspector general of police for Tanganyika at the material time, the inspector general of police would not be appointed pursuant to the IGP's political base, because politics was not part and parcel of the decision-making process of a governor. What was important to the governor is that the Queen remains head of state in the country, and not necessarily politicize. In fact, he wasn't supposed to politicize the Queen at all. So she would need to rise, she was always required to rise above politics. Now, in 1962, Nyerere decided to give up the premiership and to go along the presidential route. What then happened was he went around the country informing the general public that the monarchy, or the constitutional monarchy, was just another arm of colonialism. So I wasn't born at the time, but the general public apparently thought this was not a good idea, and he sold the presidential way of running governance to the general public. I'm not so sure if actually it mattered much, because ultimately it was TANU, the Tanganyika party that brought the Tanganyika to independence, that was in power and had won 71 out of 72 of the parties, of the seats in parliament. And they decided that the way to go was to create a republic with a president. And this is where I believe we went terribly wrong. We created a republic, we had a president, but all the powers that were given to the Queen by the Westminster Constitution were then handed to the president. So the president then got to appoint everybody, the IGP, the head of the army, the permanent secretaries. He had absolute power. Now, this may be so, this may be acceptable when you have a monarchy, a constitutional monarchy, and the monarch is not politicized. However, when you have a presidential system and the president is a politician and comes from a political party, to allow the president to appoint members of the armed forces at his will, members of the civil service at his will, members of the judiciary, judges and so on, at his will, is to politicize, in my view, important institutions of the republic itself. And that was the beginning of I believe, the end of independence of our institutions. And immediately after we became a republic, we then became a one-party state. And the argument to form a one-party state was, well, as usual, it's very African for us not to have opposition. We should all sit and discuss. It's easier for us to sit and discuss in an environment where there is no partisanship. If we do continue with partisan politics, we would disable the concept of nationhood, and we would deteriorate into tribalism and religious affiliations, which is extremely dangerous, and so on and so forth. The truth is, TANU wanted absolute power, and so they got absolute power. And the decision to become a one-party state was not one that was made by the general public. It was one that was forced upon them by TANU. And TANU had, and it was made at the national executive level of the party. So we then proceeded along. TANU put us through the one-party system. They put us through the Arusha Declaration and Ujamaa socialism. We went then through the war with the nationalization of private assets, bumbled along through the war with Uganda, and then we come to 1985. Nyerere is still president, and he is, by that time, president for life. Then he decides, well, this is probably not a good idea for me to remain president for life. And he has been heard to say that he wanted to set an example of transition of power, peaceful transition of power. So he resigned from the presidency in November 1985, and power was transferred within, of course, now, by this time we had CCM TANU merged with ASP in 1977, which is the Afro-Shirazi Party from Zanzibar, and formed the CCM, the Chama cha Mapinduzi. We had a new constitution, the 1977 constitution, which institutionalized the imperial presidency, and the president became an absolute monarch, I would say. So with a very weak parliament system, in which the president could appoint several members of parliament, had power to appoint parliamentarians, and the party ran the show. The party became the state. I think the party, CCM, became bigger than Tanzania. And I've always found that fascinating, because I sort of say, CCM would do well to remember that no other country would want CCM other than Tanzania. So it is essential that CCM keeps Tanzania intact, because I don't think any other country in the region would want CCM. So be that as it may, we then get to 1985, and we have a transition, the first transition of power from Nyerere within CCM to Ali Hassan Mwinyi. And immediately after the transition of power, Nyerere was extremely vocal, and he taught us dissent. It's the first time we actually see outright dissent against the president. And it is Nyerere criticizing Mwinyi and the manner in which Mwinyi was running the country. In 1992, we have something, Tanzania goes through a second transition, so to speak, in which our Chief Justice was asked to talk to the people and find out if we wanted multi-party democracy. 20% of the general populace wanted multi-party democracy. Nevertheless, Nyerere, still very powerful within CCM. Oh, by the way, when he left the presidency, the transition of power was not quite complete. He remained chairman of CCM, which was the party, the sole party in Tanzania, for another 5 years. So he was essentially in control. And in 1992, he convinces CCM that multi-party democracy was the way to go. Now, this is where we get it gets very, very interesting. Tanzania has never had to, well, Tanganyika has never had to fight for independence. And we've never again had to fight for multi-party democracy. CCM decided to hand that to us in 1992. There was then an amendment of the Constitution. Interestingly, what they did with the Constitution is just remove one part of it, that of the CCM being the only party, but retained all the other levers of power that the president has over the country. And that is when we move into the second transition. Now, this is what I find interesting about this transition. Was the transition truly a democratic transition for transition's sake, or for democracy, or was it a camouflage? And my view is that it was a camouflage. CCM never intended to actually leave power through a democratic process. And we've seen this time and time again in Zanzibar, and we are seeing it play out now in Tanzania mainland, in Tanzania as a whole. The first time that CCM has ever been threatened was in 2015, when the opposition started nipping very close to CCM's heels, at least on the mainland, in Tanzania mainland. And it is the first time that CCM saw itself in Tanzania mainland winning by 56%. It's never happened before. And there are those who would argue that it lost that particular election. However, it's the lowest that CCM has ever polled in an election. So suddenly, CCM was at an existential risk. And the risk, and I believe that if CCM were to lose power, they would go the route of Kanu, into oblivion. And for the first time, CCM is facing this existential risk. How does it react to this risk? It becomes more repressive, and it goes into itself and tries to retain power by actually crushing the opposition, by using levers of power, state levers of power, to crush the opposition that were until then nipping at the CCM heels, and actually had taken, few bites from the heel. And suddenly CCM is feeling threatened by this and starts being, shows its dark side. I call it the dark side of CCM, by being extremely oppressive. We've had, for the first time in our history, other than the assassination of my grandfather, we've seen an attempted assassination of an MP during this regime. He had just left Parliament in 2017, 7th of September 2017, and he was shot in Dodoma, in a government compound, by the way. 17 times, 16 or 17 times. His bullets hit his body 16 times, and his car was shot in excess of 32 times. Now, he lived to tell the tale, as he likes to say, but it didn't stop there. We've had members of the opposition stabbed, members of the opposition disappear. Recently, the head of the opposition, Freeman Boys, had his legs broken, his leg broken in an attack whilst going home. And none of these attacks have been dealt with effectively by the police. They always come up with one excuse after another why they cannot investigate and deal with these attacks on the opposition. For me, this is extremely disheartening, because what we do see is an acceptance by CCM that within CCM, that power can only transition in Tanzania within the confines of CCM. So CCM will accept a transition of power from one man to another every 10 years. And I have to say, it has to be a man. I haven't seen a woman yet being given the reins of power. From one man to another every 10 years. However, power is not allowed to transition outside CCM. So the concept of power transitioning to a party other than CCM is unfathomable for these people. And my question always is, how long do they think they can continue like this for? For how long? At some point, power will have to transition from CCM to another party. This is inevitable. It's been inevitable in all African countries that we have looked at. Power has transitioned. And it may have transitioned. My concern is that the transition has to be a peaceful transition. We do not want a transition of power that is brought about by social unrest and fatigue by the voters. Voter fatigue and voter frustration, that their will is not being respected by CCM. Now, how has CCM ensured that transition of power is kept within the party structure itself? Very simply, by ensuring that it appoints all the people with the firepower. The president appoints all the people with the firepower, from the army to the police. The president appoints all the people who count the votes, from the chairman of the Electoral Commission, the director of the Electoral Commission, to also the members of parliament. He still appoints 10 members of parliament. And really, he appoints the judges. So our whole institutional infrastructure, power infrastructure, is in the hands of one man, who is the president. He also appoints returning officers of the Electoral Commission. So we have a system that is completely one-sided. And what I find scary about this is this. If this system gets into the wrong hands, it will be very painful on CCM themselves. So why does CCM want to retain power? Because I think the most important of all is security. If our constitutional system goes to the opposition, who have suffered greatly, greatly under CCM, I think CCM themselves are fearful that this power will be turned against them. So what is the solution? For me, the solution, we should have arrived at that solution during Kikwete's period, which was the amendment of our constitution or the implementation of a new constitution, which is more people-centric, which disempowers the presidency, creates a much more level playing field, creates independent institutions, so that when we hand over, when there is a transition of power, the ex-president or the people, the group of people who lose power do not fear repercussions, because we would have strong institutions to ensure that they are protected against repression. Unfortunately, that was a missed opportunity by the Kikwete administration, and I don't see the Magufuli administration changing that. Way forward, I've listened carefully to the discussion on Rwanda, and I'm concerned that that is where we're heading. A very one-sided parliament. Our president, John Pombe Magufuli, has said in public that he does not want to amend the Constitution of the United Republic of Tanzania to continue in power. However, what played out in Uganda, in Rwanda, is now playing out in Tanzania. Before the close of this parliament, because we're going to elections in October, the Speaker of Parliament made it clear that when Parliament comes back next time, they will amend the Constitution of the United Republic of Tanzania to ensure that Magufuli continues in power. So we have the president on the one hand saying, I have no intentions of continuing in power, but we have Parliament on the other hand saying, a parliament that is CCM majority, saying we want the president to continue in power. And unfortunately, I think in this particular instance, since it's Parliament that amends the Constitution, if Tanzanians are not careful in the elections of, in October, in our October 2020 elections, and we proceed to vote a parliament that is more than 70% CCM, we will have an amended constitution, because I think you have to take people at their word. And the Speaker of Parliament, the outgoing Speaker of Parliament, Job Ndugai, has made it clear that that amendment will go through, will be tabled before Parliament, and will go through. So I take this very seriously, because I think we are taking a note from Rwanda's playbook, and we will most likely play it out. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really fascinating when you hear from all of you like this, and how much we have learned from each other, how much we continue to learn from each other. And I really appreciate the way you showed us the other direction, that when we, following the model that Dave Ndii had given us, picking up on that phrase, the imperial presidency, which I think is what is going to stay in my mind. And that interesting twist that after Tanzania moved to a Westminster model for a brief, if you want, historical moment, the transition to a presidential model actually ironically made the president into the very monarch that the country had seemed, to be transitioning away from. And then you showed us very clearly how it became less about a person and became about a party retaining power and managing that transition. I also thought that phrase that you gave us, that Nyerere taught us dissent, has been really, really interesting, because normally you think of people who have been in power as running away from dissent. So that was a really interesting twist. And then you helped us reflect on what it means when a transition happens between people, and people often celebrate in the East African region, Tanzania, for having this regular transition of power from one president to another, but helping us think through what does that really mean in terms of transition when a party preempts the transfer of power from that party by retaining it within itself, keeping it within itself. And if that therefore means that we never get to see a more comprehensive transition of power that allows real political alternatives. And I think the questions you left us with at the end, taking us back, as we heard in the case of Rwanda, on when we think about power and we think about this conundrum of power and the transfer of power, that we must also think about security. What happens when those who have been in power leave office? And how do we make it easier for people to leave office? And then, of course, what lessons can we learn? And Malawi has all of us feeling really excited. So thank you very much for, I think in a way, that really wrapped up a lot of the what we have heard this afternoon. What we are going to do now, as you can see, we've gone over time, and the decision was taken not to go into a plenary session. I think, as you will all agree, that what we have heard from David, from Lewis, and from Fatma has been so rich that we decided to let each one of them be able to complete what they had prepared for us. And so we will not go into the plenary session. What I will do is go directly to Kwamachetsi Makoha, who is going to, and I love the phrase, he's going to crochet the everything all together from both sessions. Kwamachetsi Makoha is a journalist, editor, and satirist. He is a poet, and he calls himself a closet theater artist. Kwamachetsi has held editorial positions in Kenya's leading newspapers. He is a very key player in defining the contours of journalism in Kenya, and he is currently the Kenyan head of office for Journalists for Justice, who are our co-hosts for this webinar. And those of you who remember the report Black and White, which described the involvement of Kenyan military in the smuggling of charcoal and sugar in Kismayu, Kwamachetsi was the one who put that together. And so it's such a pleasure to see how he will put together all the plenary sessions, everything that we have heard for us this afternoon. So thank you very much, Fatma, and welcome, Kwamachetsi.
Thank you, Mushai. As the back room gets my issues sorted, I'll just begin by, of course, saying I am not much at crocheting, but at least if I make claims to being in theater arts, at least I know that you and I have shared a stage, even if it's many decades back.
That's true. That's so true.
All right. So I think it's been a very heavy afternoon, and we've been given a lot to chew on. So I think let me just try and put everything together. What I heard, at least Brian Kagoro was able to frame the debate around 5 crises of power, authority, state citizenship and ideas, and outlined transitional management and the players or interest formations that influence those transitions. He outlined militarization, lumpenization, where we are losing generations or a generation of youth, financialization, which is the activity of local, international, multinational finance, theocratization or religious formations, which are no longer informal sources of power, but they actually have a very active mass interest in power, then ethno-regionalism. Having framed that the debate thus far, he was able, I think, to give two very vivid examples of transitions or inchoate transitions in both Zimbabwe and Nigeria, where, and I think the thrust of what he was saying is that the political leaders that we see are only marketers for deeper interests in the nation state, and suggested that we were where we are because of a crisis of imagination, that we are actually not able to unpack all those interests that he had outlined, which were creating the crisis around the five crises he mentioned. Taking off from that very lofty, if you like, ivory tower, then Miriam Matembe was able to bring us down to earth with a very lived experience of Uganda. And I'm just going to summarize what she said in about 3 sentences. The first is that the transitions in Uganda have been inchoate. They've been frustrated or incomplete. Uganda has not been in the hands of citizens. And right now, we are looking at a country whose power and authority is captured by one person and his clan, as to use her words. So the challenge, the way she framed it, was reclaiming the agency required, which requires a mind shift. Next door, that's listening to Karine Nantulia from Burundi. Again, she explained that there's been a frustrated transition or the abandonment of rules of engagement in the Arusha Accords, which had a lot of political goodwill. And this then resulted in the crisis in 2015 when Pierre Nkurunziza abandoned the agreement or the rules in the Accords to run for a 3rd term. And what she was able to explain the transition in Burundi as, or what made Nkurunziza stay on despite having a referendum that removed term limits, was one, entrenched pushback internally within the CNDD, which is the ruling party, and what she was calling a committee of generals. I think there are certain things that are emerging, and I'll try and see if I can tie them at the end. Then, of course, the other thing that she raised as a factor is what she was calling isolation fatigue, which is that Burundi was also getting tired of being excluded from being the pariah, if you like, of the region and of the world. But the crisis in Burundi, from her understanding and from my explanation, is that there hasn't been much of an example from the region. Burundi does not have people to learn from or nations to learn from. For me, the takeaway from what she was saying is that the East African community is not ECOWAS. If you remember, ECOWAS is very muscular in how it intervenes in political crisis in West Africa. Specifically, I've been more recently perhaps in the Gambia, where Yahya Jammeh thought that he might want to walk back on his concession after losing the election. Coming to Kenya, David Ndii was able to locate transition right, I think, back to the 19th century by explaining that explaining traditional succession arrangements that then yielded to using elections to manage transitions. For him, his locus is to say that continuity in stability turns on legitimacy and orderly transfer of power. And so that historically, we've had a frustrated transition within traditional spaces, transitional power spaces, citing, I think, Kikuyu, Luhya, and several others, and that transition was stolen by the creation of independence moments, and that independence in itself created new monsters, where then you had the phenomenon of presidents for life. So the first transition in Kenya was the death of Jomo Kenyatta, which is a forced transition. Then the multi-party, the change of the altering of the constitution to allow multi-party, which allowed term limits. But term limits have created a new problem in the Kenyan experience, which is a sense of entitlement by presidents that when you have a limit of 2 terms, then it means that you must have 2 terms. You can't serve 1 term and not go away. And of course, the current situation in Kenya, where there is, even after a forced second term, there are negotiations about exiting or not exiting for the current president. 3 things emerge from what David Ndii was saying. One is that there's a disconnect between the legitimacy of rules and the political culture of not accepting the transfer of power. The contradiction, and this contradiction, I think we'll be able to tie it up with what Fatuma was saying in the end, which is there's a strong element, there's a paradox of wanting longevity, but choosing political systems that do not allow that longevity. So that conversation, I think, centers around establishing the imperial presidency. But generally, I think one of the things he mentioned that I think is significant to repeat is that those in power are uneasy with citizens managing transitions through elections. And there's a strong element of personal power and its attractions that make it difficult for people to want to leave. I'll be able to speak to a bit of that at the end. And the question, of course, is what is it about political power that makes it so attractive that people don't want to leave? Louis Marge was able to present an interesting picture, a very, very historical view of Rwanda. What I understood, and I think without repeating everything he said, is that Paul Kagame seduced people in Rwanda into believing that a transition was possible, but spent much of his time in the first time to actually eliminate political competition, specifically Pastor Bizimungu, and then everybody else who's shown up. He's decimated the opposition and then brought in a referendum to extend his rule. The way he did that was to posture as a reluctant president. Of course, it sounds amusing when you discuss it in the safety of Zoom, but I mean, I was just astounded by the fact, by the mention of the fact that there were people threatening to kill themselves. And I mention that because I think it points to the instrumentalization of the genocide in Rwanda. And the fears that evokes in the rest of the region and the world. So the complication around Kagame is that he has done well in terms of infrastructure and economic development, even if the gaps around freedom, political participation, and media, that he appears to be afraid of his own inner circle, and so has spent a lot of energy emasculating his opponents. The population seems to be captured because of narratives around genocide, but I think something that Louis emphasized, which I would like to repeat, is that the genocide did not occur because of political space and media freedom, that should not negate the argument that Rwanda is not ready for a transition. Fatma, who was our last speaker, I think articulated the question of abandonment of the Westminster model, which was constructively running away from supervision and oversight by creating a power grab that's Republican that has also collapsed neutrality of the bureaucracy and the securocracy, politicization of institutions, and installation of a one-party state. So it's basically, Tanzania is basically a presidential monarchy, and the Chama cha Mapinduzi, or CCM, has become larger than Tanzania. So all the transitions that have occurred in Tanzania have actually occurred within CCM rather than within the larger Tanzanian community. And that the transitions, the issues around transition in Tanzania are complicated by the fact that Tanzania does not have a history of struggle or violence around independence, multi-party, or any of the other things that the other countries in the region are facing. So CCM has camouflaged or has succeeded in camouflaging transitions by running ahead of them. What do I see in all of this? I think the one thing that is a thread right through all the 5 conversations and examining the 5 countries is one, that all these countries went the direction of presidential systems: Uganda, Burundi, Rwanda, Tanzania, Kenya, and they are walking out of those. Arrangements because they went in for presidential systems that are sort of imperial, very poor supervision. And when the initial term limits come to an end, they all are electing to walk out of them. So how do we tie this back to our theoretical framework that Brian Kagoro mentioned? I think, without belaboring the point, the issue is that I think there are various interest formations around military. There is an element of military. We haven't had much of it in Tanzania, but from all the presentations, you very, very clearly cannot miss the nexus between the military, finance or money, public mobilization, and political power. Perhaps I could just stop there. There are a lot of questions. There are a lot of questions that have been raised in the Q&A, but I am not going to go into them because of the limitations of time. So perhaps I'll just stop there and hope that you can pick it up from there, Mshai. Thank you.
Thank you very much, my fellow thespian. You have done an excellent job, and indeed, there's such a lively discussion on the chat and so many great questions. I really want to, even before I hand back to George Kegoro, really thank the participants. I think one way that even as a presenter, people get energized is to see that people are really engaging. And it's been wonderful to see that the discussion hasn't just been questions on the chat, but that you have indeed engaged, you've shared your own ideas. And so that has really been something to see. I also want to thank the presenters. If you asked a question on the Q&A, I just want to draw your attention that most of the questions there have been answered. And I thank the presenters because I know they've been following what's going on, but have still taken the time to give some really comprehensive answers. And we do apologize that we haven't had the plenary, but we did think it was important to make sure that each one of the presenters had enough time to speak. Let me truly, truly thank David D, Lewis Mudge, and Fatma Karume. After listening to that excellent first session with Brian, Miriam, and Karine, I really wondered if this second plenary would be able to match the promise of that first session, and you have definitely delivered. I also really want to thank Journalists for Justice and the Kenya Human Rights Commission for hosting us and making this such a wonderful space. I think many of the participants have commented on what a wonderful lecture this is. And Dave, and as I hand over to George, let me ask what we're all asking. Would it be possible to get a record of some of this, some of the chats, some of the answers on the questions, as well as the YouTube? Over to you, George, and thank you.
So thank you very much, Mshai, for an excellent job of moderating the second session. You would not know, people, that we only grafted Mshai into this moderating business when our colleague in Uganda failed, was made unable to participate as the conversation was going on. And she's done a good job. It's as though she had prepared for this, and yet she hadn't. So Mshai, you've been truly excellent in marshalling the discussion, and I thank you very much for doing it, and for the courage to accept to do it with such little preparation, and to also thank the panelists, the very excellent panel that we've had, the two panels, the first and the second one. You've both been very good, brought us new information and insights, and also helped us to understand very clearly the issues that are at play in the various countries. And Kwamchetsi for also providing a very good summary of the discussions, but also an interpretation of what is it that links everything together, which is countries have taken up one mode of government, and they are quickly abandoning that because they want longevity, which it cannot give them. And of course, as part of that longevity project, it is also busting the term limits and their strategies that they've used for that. So we struggled a lot in preparing this for this webinar. We struggled a lot about questions of format, questions of what its coverage should or could be, questions of whether or not there would be interest, questions of how long it could or should be. We thought that making it this long, because we've had 3 hours and more, it's actually now 3.5 hours since we started. We struggled with whether or not any of all those things was reasonable. And I think there are lessons we are all learning, because we've not done this before ourselves, and it's something that we are learning together about. And feel free to feedback to us about your experiences on this. One of the constant feedbacks we've had in the chats and otherwise is that this is something we should do again. Yes, this is something we will do again. We want to plan these webinars regularly, and we are asking that you be on the lookout for the next one, which is likely. We are exploring the next one to be around Malawi. We want the war stories of Malawi to be told to a larger audience than the Malawians themselves, and so we will reach out to you to tell when this is ready. They're also, as Malawi heals and shines as an example of a democratic success, Ethiopia up north is imploding. And just this afternoon, just before this call, we got information from very reliable information that the Ethiopian crisis is going to spill over, is likely to spill over into northern Kenya, and that we should start preparing for that possibility. So Ethiopia isn't that far removed. It is going to be a crisis that affects all of us in very directly. So we are also creating this as a space where we can respond to emerging issues as they emerge, rather than waiting for them to play out and then to be speaking about them in a post-mortem manner. So there has been a desire, I think, by all of us that we should have regional conversations that are not confined to our countries. That is part of the desire that we are fulfilling in coming up with this kind of platform. There's also a desire, I think, among ourselves that there should be not just conversational, regional conversations, but there should also be regionally focused action. by groups such as ourselves. We are hoping that the conversations that we have started, like this one, will also lead us into a space where concrete action that is regionally based rather than based in our countries is going to become possible, and is going to, we're going to both inform and energize that kind of action. So the promise we make on behalf of JFJ and Kenya Human Rights Commission is that we'll do this again, and we'll call you when you are ready with it. To thank you very, very much for staying for what has ended up being a very long conversation, but what has ended up being an extremely interesting conversation as well. A recording of which is available and will be distributed to your, will be made available on the Kenya Human Rights Commission YouTube page. And if you want other forms of recording, like the transcribed recording, that will also be made available to participants. So to thank you very much for participating, to thank the excellent panelists for bringing us such deep and reflections and experiences from the countries that you covered, and to also welcome your suggestions on how improvements can be made going forward, and how additional partnerships, because this partnership isn't viewed as stuck between Kenya Human Rights Commission and Journalists for Justice, but we would also like to expand and reimagine the partnerships in ways that make it more sustainable, that also make it easier for all of us to carry the load of leadership in these types of conversations. So again, thanks everybody for your participation, and the people who have worked behind the behind the scenes, including the interpreters, who the two excellent interpreters, that is Aziz Ramdani and Moses Aswa. Thank you very much for working with us. Also, I think those are the people behind and the staff of KHRC and JFJ who have also supported putting this together. We thank everybody, and with that, I wish you a good afternoon. There are people who of course have got who have very different time zones. I should have said that. People in the US, we appreciate the fact that this was probably a very early start for you, and that is a reason for additional appreciation of your participation. Thank you very much.